sees the world way different from the Brazilian mine worker, sees the world way differently from the child sex tourism industry, the Indian child labor settings. Yeah, I didn't meet this guy, but I met his brother probably. I was in a cab going back from a meeting in Chicago to the airport, and our cab driver was from Kazakhstan, and he wanted to know, what's that? Borat. Well, I don't know. His guy was not Borat, and he wanted to know if we were looking for anything, you know, cocaine, women, you know, he could do it all for us, you know, and you know, it's a scary world out there.
He looks like a white guy from here.
Yeah,
Caucasian.
he is. Well, Kazakhstan is Russia, Caucasian, Caucasus Mountains, Caucasian Mountains. Yeah, it's a scary world out there, and I just brushed up against it in the cab, but you know, you see it. All right, so muted group theory. This is the one that's tied into this. We're not going to spend quite as much time on it, but it's very similar in some sense. Now, muted group theory sort of builds on top of standpoint theory in a sense for us, in that it says there are groups of people who don't have their worldviews heard. But this theory takes not a phenomenological perspective, but a language perspective. And it says the problem is that human language is man-made language. Again, this is a feminism kind of a gender argument going on in this muted group theory. And that language is largely man's language. And so there are no words available for women's experience to be voiced. So that if women want to voice their experience, they are forced to use men's language to give voice to their experience, which then distorts it because it's filtered through men's structures and men's prejudices. This is the argument of muted group theory, and it can be applied to any group that is marginalized and oppressed, where you have it's difficult or impossible for other worldviews to be articulated. Articulated meaning, you know, expressed, put into words, explained. So language and voices are devalued or have no place to speak or no language to speak. So this theory asks us to pay real careful attention to the language that people have available to them and what is possible to say in that language. So here's a quick example. This week I work with someone, a mother, who we were talking about this, and she said, well, here's my story. I was a working mother working at night, and the fellow women asked me, who's babysitting your children? And she said, no one's babysitting my children. My husband is parenting our children.
I say that to my son's brother. You can't babysit yours.
Yeah, right. It's a language issue.
Oh, I would have never thought that.
Well, but she's like, well, let's get this straight. You know, you're using language, right? You're using language that I don't accept, the structure you're putting on the world. And I'm going to challenge your language with new language. You know, my husband is parenting our children, is the way she put it to him. What's that?
So I guess if I was a mom, I would.
You might say that. Well, if you were this woman, you would. You know, and she's understood that if I just let the language go on, it blocks me into certain structures. And this is built around a theory of language that a couple of places, you don't necessarily need to know these really in depth, but you should be aware of them. There's something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. This is not like in Star Trek Worf. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis says that people will only perceive what they have language to describe. So if part of the story to this is that, I can't remember which one of these it was at one point in his life worked as an insurance adjuster. And so he would go to scenes of arson, for instance, and try to look around at what was there. And because he was trained as an arson investigator, he had language to describe what he was looking for, and he would see things that other people missed because they didn't have the language to describe the particular things he was looking for. And so the argument here is that your language filters the world you will perceive. A simple way to think about this is to think about the difference between a person who's a professional in a field and a person who just is going to a store, for instance. Let's say you're a marketing specialist, right? You're a marketing specialist. You have all kinds of language and training about marketing and arrangement of products and colors and displays and all kinds of things. So you walk into a store and you see all kinds of things that you have language to describe. You're saying, all right, I see what's going on here, I understand this. An ordinary person walks in, and what do they see? The store. Oh, there was a store and there were displays. Well, a marketing professional says, oh, okay, what was a tier 3, you know, retail outlet, and it had these. They have all kinds of other language. They see things that you don't see. And so the argument here is that depending on the language you have, there are things you won't even think about or perceive in the world, and that there are groups of people that when they try to express their experience, the language doesn't let them do it because the language doesn't work for their experience. There's no words for it. Another person who talks about this is a fellow named Gadamer, who was a linguist, philosophical linguist kind of a person. Hans Georg Gadamer. He was a philosopher of language. And he came to the point where he said, every individual person comes to consciousness in language. So before you have a language, you don't have a self or an I. You can't think. We all think in a language. Now, it's kind of hard to test that, right? Because, but that's his argument, is that we all think in a language, and that language embeds prejudice. So every language is already not value neutral. Every language has within it certain biases. There are things that it applauds, and there are things that it puts down. So for instance, in Griffin's book, he talks about the fact that if you have men who are sexually loose, there may be these words, you know, a couple dozen words. But if you have women who are sexually loose, there are like hundreds of words.
Yeah, what is that?
Well, Gadamer and the muted group theory would say that is because the language is prejudiced against women. That it is built into the language to be more descriptive of women's laxity than men's laxity. So it embeds prejudice. So you are never prejudice-free. You are always already prejudiced by the language you use, and you don't know what you don't know. I want you to just stop for that phrase. I don't know, how many of you have heard that phrase before? You don't know what you don't know. Yeah. Where have you heard that?
First place was landmark education.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And what did they want to do with that? Do you remember?
There wanted you to become conscious of what you don't know that you don't know.
Yes, become aware of what you don't know, which is where standpoint theory says other people know things you don't know because of where they stand in life and in the world, and you don't even know that you don't know it. So you will only start to know you don't know it when you come into contact with people who do know it. It's a tough thing to say, but it's really important. No, it's not a conundrum. It's a very important truth, because you have no idea. You can't say, well, let's think about something we don't know. You can't do it because you don't know it. But if you encounter a child labor kid, he knows things about the world that you don't know, and you don't even know you don't know him. So you can learn from him, or people who've been in human trafficking. I remember the first time this happened to me with my friends from Liberia, you know, where I was in a conversation with them, and they were having an argument about his behaviors in Liberia. And apparently in Liberia, corruption and a lot of loose morals was just part of the government system that he was in. And he was arguing with his wife here that this is America, it's different, it's a whole different thing. That's not the way it happens here. We don't do that here. You know, it's a different world that we're living in. And so he knew things that I didn't even know I didn't know. But until I encountered someone who had a different standpoint, I didn't know it. So language and voice, it becomes very important. So Griffin's notes on this, you can get them again off the page. Language is a human construction. From this perspective, language is a human construction, and it's a male construction. Men constructed language. And so it expresses men's prejudices and men's standpoint and men's perspectives on the world. And so women's thoughts are at a disadvantage when they try to express them, because the language doesn't exist to think those thoughts or to express those thoughts within the male language structure. And so women have to speak in using men's language, and that already reshapes what they're trying to say. So within muted group theory, there's the emphasis on creating new language and new words.
How are we supposed to speak in men's language if we don't know men's language?
Well, Kramer would say to you that by and large, all language is men's language already. So this is where, if you watch the video interview with Griffin and Kramer, at the end of it, he says something in her about women's studies curriculums in school, in universities. And he says, well, maybe then we should have men's studies curriculums in the school. And she says, that's what they already are. They already are men's studies.
It's true, because that's why they have, I took women's studies last year. Right. And they're like, well, why do we call it women's studies? And they're like, well, because everything else is men's studies, right? The one thing. That's a common point within this theory, yeah, that language is men's language and studies is men's studies. And so for women to express their experience in men's studies programs with men's language is already a major disadvantage. So there needs to be, so she works on creating new language. And
I just question whether the language is really men's language, or is the language just reflective of the dominance that the male gender has sort of perpetuated over the female gender, and so the language reflects that state.
Yeah, I don't think there's a need to distinguish between that. I don't think Kramer is insisting like there's some conspiracy and some deliberate effort to do this. I don't think that's the point. When you study critical traditions and critical studies of communication, it's not always the point that somebody is deliberately reproducing this, but it just feels natural. And that's the issue, is that it feels natural. Let me give you an example of this. My brother was a graphic artist in college. He designed illustrations and graphics for news shows. So he got his internship was at the McNeil-Lehrer Report. I don't know if any of you remember the McNeil-Lehrer Report. It was a typical news show where there'd be somebody talking and then there'd be an image to go along with the story. And so when my brother was interning at McNeil-Lehrer was when the Challenger space shuttle exploded on takeoff. And so he went into work that day. They said the Challenger space shuttle just exploded. President Reagan's going to be making this big speech about it. We need a graphic. So he pulled his graphic up, you know, worked it up with the American flag in the background and a space shuttle flying up through it. Well, that was, you know, he just did it. It felt like the right images to use. So fast forward a couple of years, I'm in my graduate program at Temple University, and the professor teaching communication theory pulls up that image to explain it.
So funny.
To explain it to the class, how this reproduces American dominance in the world and all this stuff, you know, and I'm like, excuse me, I know who created that graphic, and he's not thinking about that, you know, it just felt like the right thing to do. And the professor said, well, yes. And that just shows you how the language works. That he's not intending that. He's not conspiracy that America is dominating. But it just feels natural to do. And so we do it. So in men's language, it just feels natural. And this is the issue. Is a word you probably ought to get a grip on called reification, which is where we think of human created things as if they are natural things. So we think of Montclair State University as if it was always here, you know, and it's just, that's the way, how could the world be different, you know? But it was created by people at a certain time, and it might cease to exist in the future at a certain time. It's not a given natural thing. It's a human creation. Language is a human creation. We don't have some language that dropped down out of the sky for us. We created it. And there's many languages. There's French, there's Spanish, you know, there's all kinds of languages. And all of them, she would argue, in all of them they're men's languages. And they reproduce male perspectives on things. So she says women need to work together to give voice to their experiences in new ways. She has this whole discussion of the internet. I don't know if any of you caught her whole discussion of the internet, and she doesn't think women's voices.
Like, I didn't understand that part. It's like,
yeah,
like, there's like
blogs and Facebook and MySpace and social network sites. I just reading today that Microsoft and Google are talking about paying $10 billion for Facebook.
He ignored the first offer. It was like $1.5 billion.
Yeah.
2 years ago. He just didn't take it.
Yeah, I think here's another case where Griffin's book is just a little behind the edge, you know. I mean,
what do they do with it? Like, now advertise stuff on it?
well, it becomes part of their, yeah, they interact.
Yeah, I remember these months now.
They're buying something that has a huge network already in place.
Right.
And now they can just pump anything in.
Yeah, they just pump their stuff and it shoots through the network and viral marketing. Those of you in PR, who's in PR here? Yeah, have you ever studied yet the issues of viral marketing? And no, but you understand it. You know, that something happens, someone sends someone an email, they send an email, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden 100,000 people watch this YouTube video, you know.
On MySpace a while ago, Fox paid $660 million just for advertising rights.
Yeah.
Not to own the website, not to be in any kind of administrative control, just to be able to promote their program.
Didn't MySpace just get bought out too by somebody?
Yeah, I think, who bought MySpace?
Isn't it News Corp?
Yeah, that was Murdoch, I think. Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, right. There was a big discussion about that. Yeah, so in this chapter, there's this whole argument that internet is men's space, men's communication space. I don't know.
I'm hearing a lot about men. Where's the women?
Well, that's what she's, right.
Just a comment. I think that women can very easily communicate in the man's world about a lot of men issues, where when it comes to women issues, men cannot relate, period, such as breastfeeding, menopause, a lot, reproduction, all of that stuff. But when it comes to sports, okay, I'm a bigger sport fan than my husband is.
Right.
But I feel like that's more male related.
Yeah.
All the sports are men. When you think about it, baseball, football, there's no women in there. But they're trying to get them in the respect of maybe a newscaster. If you've noticed, a lot of these baseball games there's a lot of women in that end of it, but there's still not a woman umpire or a woman player, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
They still talk the talk.
But I think Kramer would want to argue that still all those institutions are about male values of competition, conquering, winning, defeating, and that we have yet to see what a women's world might look like if there wasn't so much of the masculine women's language.
Like, let's say for myself, I was named after my father, and my father's name was John, I was named Joan. All right, it starts way back, way back.
Right.
However, I was raised to be a sports nut. I still am a sports nut. But I'm just saying that I can relate more to that world than maybe even my husband can, and he's a man.
Right. And I think that I could see Griffin and Kramer saying to you, you probably have an advantage then in the male structured world because you can move within it well that way, right? So she has her dictionary there. I'm interested in your comments on her dictionary of women's definitions of words and new words. Whether you like that or not, you're going to have to tell me. I'm too old. You know, I don't get it. See, where is that? Her dictionary. No, it's on page 503. What is she trying to do with this? Family man, for instance, family man refers to a man who shows more concern with members of the family than is normal. There is no label family woman, since that would be heard as redundancy.
Because that's like going back to saying like women are more, they nurture people.
The prejudice in language for the definition of women is that they nurture people more. So like Julia Wood in this chapter goes through this incident with her father where he says, gee, I wasn't glad I had daughters, but now I am now that I'm old because you're going to take care of me. And you're going to give up your academic career, whereas I can't ask my sons to do that.
No, because she's like, why don't you hire
right.
like a nurse or whatever.
Right.
Like,
well, in his generation, that's not the way they thought.
Like years ago, I used to look for extra money to deliver milk, and I can't tell you how many times I heard, oh, Mom, the milkman's here, and they knew I wasn't a man.
Yeah.
But are there milk women? There are.
Well.
But it's interesting. That's what it was known as.
Right. She argues that one of the victories that women have accomplished in language was to introduce the term sexual harassment.
Business person.
Well, business person.
But
But
I
like the language seems it'll change as well. Like the more you see it, you know, the more you see a family man, it'll become a family woman. The more there's a working woman, you know. So it's
maybe
as it shifts, because back then it was businessmen. All you saw in business were men, and now that there's a businesswoman, right. You know, business persons.
Well, she argues that women are at a disadvantage in advancing as long as the language pushes against them, or stands against them. Well, let's talk about sexual harassment as a linguistic victory for women. So her argument is that for a long time the problem existed of sexual harassment in the workplace. You know, jokes, pictures, approaches, all these things in the workplace. But there was no language for it. What would it have been called before the term sexual harassment came out?
Boys will be boys.
Boys will be boys.
Maybe it could get to like the closest, like it makes me really uncomfortable.
All right, I'm uncomfortable, so it's you're oversensitive.
Yeah.
You know, yeah, so that would have been the term. So now all of a sudden we have new language called sexual harassment, now which gets into laws, which gets into organizations, which gets into corporate training, things like this. And so that reshapes the experience of women because there's new language.
And they also quote that for men now, too.
Yes, it can work both ways. Yep. Yeah.
Same thing, just that it's crossed the gender barrier.
So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's become integrated into society, I think.
Yeah.
It was odd to hear that there was sexual harassment about a man years ago, but it has been since.
Yes. Yeah.
Like you think to yourself, what the heck could a woman do to sexually harass a man?
I mean,
Yeah, you know what I mean? Why? We won't get into that.
That only can work.
They don't see that as sexual.
yeah, that's what I mean.
They see that as sexual gratification.
Then you're
Whoa, wait a minute. A little too much stereotype going on around here. Let's get another comment.
When I started at my job, you know, they do like those little videos or whatever.
Yeah.
And they had this guy going into this woman from another company. They're supposed to, I don't know, be doing some sort of business deal with her. She's like, well, you know, if you want this to work out, she's like, what's some business deals? She's like, you know, a foot rub to start might be kind of good. And the guy's just sitting there, he's like, started talking about
This was a training video for your job.
Usually do, you know, the man sexually harassing the woman, but yeah, this time they do like a woman sexually harassing the man.
And so what was the end of the video? I mean,
just like, wow, you know, I will not do that, and we'll see what my boss has to say. You decide.
okay.
I think the women fear more for safety too in that situation versus the man is kind of.
Well, it's still predominantly, yeah. There's a lot of, but it's changing. So Kramer-A would say that her work and the work of others has had an effect in reshaping the language. So it's a communication issue. Again, from our perspective, what we're talking about is communication. And so muted group theory makes us ask the question, whose language, why is it difficult for these people to give voice to their experience? Is there no language that they have to do it? Now this gets also into the issue of cognitive complexity and education. That the language may be available within the culture, but people may not be skilled in using it. So they may need an advocate. So this is where people who are very involved in advocacy will go to a group of people who don't have the ability to speak for themselves. Not that the language doesn't exist, but they don't know how to use the language, and someone speaks for them. So advocacy issues come in here too. All right, any thoughts or comments about muted group theory? Because next week I'm going to ask again. You know, we're going to go over each of them and say, well, muted group theory. What was that about? What would you say muted group theory is about? Somebody give me Ashley, what is muted group theory about?
It's about trying to create language for women, that women can voice their own experiences without using man-made language.
Okay.
Using language that only voices men's experiences.
Okay, so it's
giving power to the woman's word.
It's giving the language that will articulate, let's try to use that word, will articulate women's experience without using men's language to do it necessarily.
Doesn't it also apply, vice versa?
How so?
The theory, I mean, are we strictly talking about women?
Kramer A is talking about women. Yeah, I mean, I think also, like, standpoint theory is not just about feminism. I think it's about a whole lot of things. And I think, yeah, this could certainly apply to other groups as well. People who have no language with which to give voice to their experience. I mean, again, go back to the child soldier issue. Does a child soldier have the ability to give voice to his or her experience?
It's been on 2020.
Yeah, been on the State Department report notes that for women